Hello, and good evening to this evening's edition of Scotland at 7. It's a happy St Andrew's night to you, and I hope that you've spent a wonderful day celebrating all things Scottish on St Andrew's Day, our national day. Fittingly, I am joined this evening by Professor Murray Pittock, Scottish historian and academic. Hello, Murray, thanks for joining us this evening. You're the Pro Vice Principal at the University of Glasgow, I believe. Um, and I've been following with great interest in various social medias for a number of years. It's a pleasure to meet you in person. As you know, I'm Ruth Watson, and I shall be reading today's news and headlines, and then I'll come back to you and we'll have a wee stravaig through the evening's news and topics of the day. So, the Ukraine update, day 645. Ukraine said it has killed 5 high-ranking Russian officials in a strike on a building in an occupied part of Kherson. Ukrainian armed forces said the strike targeted a meeting in the village of Uvalenie following information provided by the underground and concerned local residents. Overnight on Tuesday, Ukrainian air defences shot down all of the 21 Iranian-made Shahed drones headed for the western Kamyansky region, home to a Ukrainian airbase. Ukrainian military spokesperson Alexander Stupin has said Russia is ramping up its attacks in the eastern Donetsk region. Russia had doubled its artillery fire and airstrikes and had also intensified ground infantry attacks. Russia is also likely to have begun using more 500-kilogram cluster bombs in Donetsk, according to the UK Ministry of Defence. The bombs eject 100 to 350 smaller bombs over a wide area. Russian forces claim to have taken control of the village of Kromovka in the Donetsk region. The village is on the western edge of Bakhmut, a city that fell to Russia over summer after a months-long battle and which remains the scene of heavy fighting. Russian casualties since the beginning of the war stand at 327,580, according to the Ukrainian military. In its latest daily update, Ukraine's general staff said the figure had increased by 1,140. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has warned that the bloc must not underestimate Russia and its ability to continue fighting the war in Ukraine. Russia's economy is on a war footing. Putin has a high tolerance for casualties, and Russian aims in Ukraine have not changed, he said. The European Union has delivered about 300,000 of the 1 million shells it has promised to Ukraine, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has said. Kuleba said the demands of Ukraine's war effort meant there was a need for greater alignment of Ukrainian and NATO arms production and to create a Euro-Atlantic common area of defence industries. Kuleba said that Ukraine has seen no sign that its NATO allies are tiring of the war or of providing it with support. Russia has failed in its bid to be re-elected to the Executive Council of the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. In a vote of the member states, Ukraine, Lithuania and Poland were elected to fill the 3 seats from the Eastern Europe bloc for the 2024 to 2026 term. Ukraine's sorry, that's wrong. I'm doing this on my pad. You'll have to bear with me as my mouse is skipping all over the place. Moving on to the Israel-Gaza latest. The Israel's military have confirmed today that a truce with Hamas would continue, allowing further hostage and prisoner releases and the possibility of a more durable pause in hostilities. There were frantic diplomatic efforts through the night to prolong the 6-day halt to fighting in Gaza, which had been due to end at 7 a.m. local time, that's 5 a.m. GMT. The current extension appears to be only for 24 hours, though this has yet to be explicitly confirmed by all parties. The Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, said 2 Israeli hostages had been released by Hamas today and are on their way back to Israel. They have been named as Mia Shem, 21, and Amit Susana, 40. More hostages held by Hamas are expected to be released in the coming hours. More than 100 hostages have been released and more than 140 remain in Gaza, according to the latest figures released by the Israeli government. Among those still held are 3 children and 10 people over the age of 75, the government spokesman Elon Levy said on Thursday. 2 people have been found dead, he said. Prominent Palestinian activist Ahed Tamimi was among 30 prisoners freed by Israel early on today. Ms. Tamimi has been regarded in the occupied West Bank as a hero since she was a teenager, had been arrested by Israeli troops earlier this month, accusing her of inciting violence. Her mother has denied the allegations and said it was based on a fake social media post, pardon me. Israel has so far released 210 Palestinian prisoners. 3 people were killed and 13 injured after 2 brothers from East Jerusalem shot at people waiting at a bus stop on a main road towards the western edge of the city in the rush hour, local police and medics reported. Hamas's Armed El Qassam brigades claimed responsibility for the attack. Israel's armed forces have warned people in Gaza not to travel north for your own safety and saying the area remains a war zone. Hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza have moved south in the past few weeks in response to Israeli military warnings, leading to concerns about safety and conditions. Antony Blinken has told Israel it must account for the safety and humanitarian needs of the Palestinian civilians before resuming any military operations in Gaza. The US Secretary of State met the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet in Jerusalem today before heading to the West Bank to meet the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. The United Nations has warned that the amount of aid getting into Gaza remains far too low, despite an increase afforded by the temporary ceasefire. UNICEF spokesperson James Elder said a rise in the flow of aid was the right start, but the needs in the territory were such that all this aid is triage. It's not even enough for triage. 17 Thai hostages freed by Hamas over recent days have landed back in Bangkok, where relatives had gathered at the airport to welcome them home. The latest releases bring the total number of Thai nationals freed to 23, with 9 still being held. In a television interview earlier today, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez voiced sincere doubts that Israel was respecting international law in Gaza. During a trip with his Belgian counterpart to Israel, the Palestinians and territories in Egypt last week, Sanchez criticised Israel's operation and said a Palestinian state should be recognised. First Minister Hamza Youssef has joined. Yes, sorry, I'm fiddling around with my desperately poor printout. So I mean, Maury, looking at what's going on in the world today, I mean, it's quite a it's quite a depressing situation, really, isn't it? I mean, yesterday it was sort of the United Nations sort of International Day of recognizing Palestine as a state, and I mean, it really does seem sometimes that where does it all end? I mean, what's your perspective on the situation that we find ourselves in today, or that the world finds itself in today? We've got war in Ukraine, war in Gaza, and the real potential for things just to splinter further into and have ramifications on the rest of the world.
Well, those are all extremely big questions in their own right, let alone together. But of course, they are different kinds of question. The situation in Israel and Gaza is, of course, an outbreak, a terrible outbreak of violence, which comes at the end of a prolonged process, which has tried to secure, right from the first the UN plan of 1948, a two-state solution, which has been perpetually undermined by extremists on both sides. So when we say there are 5 national leaders who've received the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in Israel-Palestine or peace in the Middle East, and of those 5, 2 at least, and possibly 3, have been murdered by their own side. So that in itself tells you what you need to know about the difficulty of resolving this situation, and the difficulty also of resolving a situation where Hamas attacks Israel and kills 1,200, 1,400, whatever it is, civilians, sometimes in absolutely terrible circumstances. And then Israel attacks the Gaza Strip, where Hamas is, for better or worse, and largely for worse for both the people who live there and for Israel, the government, having won one election in 2006 and declined to have any further elections. So it's not the legitimately recognized Palestinian Authority, but it is the government. It's such a difficult situation to work through, and it's not helped by people having very simple takes on it. In Ukraine, I think we're really looking at the bad messages that have been sent to Russia over many years by Europe and to some extent the United States, and the belief, first of all, that they could get away with partly partitioning Ukraine by taking back Crimea and also parts of the Donbass in 2014, which led to the possibility of full-scale invasion. That was, and which has now happened, that terrible price that Ukraine is paying and that Russian conscripts are also paying is, I think, a product of a lack of a firm view about the security of Europe from the EU and the US over a number of years, not least from Germany, whose Social Democratic Party have, since Schroeder lost the chancellorship 15 years plus ago, been riddled with pro-Putin sentiment and Putin's money. And of course, Schroeder got a job directly from Putin. So effectively, there are many different problems in the world. They're not the same problem, but they require two things: a sophisticated outlook which understands the complexities of the situation, and also an awareness that a lack of resolve and a lack of clarity can be extremely injurious to the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, as has been the case in Ukraine.
I mean, I think that it's one of those alarming things that when you look back over history, going through time, whether it's like Napoleon or Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great, um, there are individuals whose impact on the world are disproportionate, and it may just be that they're figureheads or even perhaps like sort of puppets of sort of wider sort of under sort of subversive sort of clans. But I mean, Putin is one of those people who his effect, his impact on the world, I think, will be discussed for generations to come, in the same way perhaps that Napoleon is. I mean, and sort of looking at the way in which Russian money and Russian crime sort of syndicates and families have infiltrated many aspects of society, not least London. I mean, sort of it is often said that sort of London runs on Russian money, and even down to Lebedev and him being installed in the House of Lords. It's it's quite insidious, isn't it? I mean, it's often the case that you don't have to sort of so much look at the events that are happening. If you follow the money, then you sort of find out the real reasons as to what's going on.
Well, indeed, and that's the case too with the plans for the supply of Russian gas to Europe. So, which of course have now have been withdrawn from in the aftermath of the Ukrainian invasion. Absolutely the case. But although it's true that Putin will be a historic figure, it is also true that uh, Russia has always wanted to have control of and to undermine Ukrainian national identity and Ukrainian national settlement. And that goes back hundreds of years. It's pretty old. One of the things that disturbs me most is the lack of understanding of history among Western leaders. Understanding history is not a guarantee that you'll understand the future, but it's the best bet we have. And if you understood anything of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine since the forced union of the Hetmanate with Russia or Muscovy as it was then in 1654, you understand exactly why this is going on. It isn't just Putin; it is a Russian mindset about Ukraine, and we have been really slow to devise the policies and the attitude which showed that we understood that and we were prepared to resist it.
Perhaps it's got something to do with the fact that for so many decades or centuries, European nations were so used to being colonizers, they've forgotten what it is to be the colonized. Perhaps they don't recognize it when it's happening before them. But I mean, moving on to COP, because the whole thing about oil and gas. I mean, it's there's some very, very good literature out there about if you want to forecast where the next war is going to be, have a look at where the next pipeline's going to be needing to go, and sort of the control of that. But anyway, so COP28 is important for many reasons, not least because we're in the middle of a climate emergency and the world's either burning or flooding around our ears. Developing countries celebrated a landmark victory on the first day of COP28 United Nations Climate Summit in Dubai, when a new loss and damage fund for the poorest and most vulnerable countries was agreed to help them deal with the irreversible impacts of climate disaster. It was met with a standing ovation from delegates. Host country, the UAE and Germany, both pledged $100 million to the Loss and Damage Startup Fund, which will aim to keep up with the rising costs caused by extreme weather and slow onset disasters such as sea level rise, ocean acidification, and melting glaciers. Germany's development minister, Svenja Schulze, said Germany and the United Arab Emirates are jointly leading the way. At the same time, we are jointly calling on all countries that are willing and able to make contributions of their own to the new fund responding to loss and damage. In this way, we are building bridges between traditional donor countries and new non-traditional donors. After all, many countries that were still developing countries 30 years ago can now afford shouldering their share of responsibility for global climate-related loss and damage. The initial funding of close to $300 million, including $60 million from the UK, $24.5 million from the US, and $10 million from Japan, is a much-needed boost for the agreement, as the loss and damage resolution does not mention scale or the replenishment cycle, which climate justice advocates say raises questions about the fund's long-term sustainability. The UAE is likely to see this as a major win for its presidency, as the two-week climate conference kicks off amid controversy over the country's oil and gas expansion plans. ADNOC, the UAE national oil company, boasted $802 million in net profits last year, a 33% rise from 2021. Sultan Al Jaber is president of both COP28 and ADNOC. Giwa Nakat, the executive director of Greenpeace MENA, that's the Middle East and North Africa, said, "This is the kind of leadership we expect from the host country, and we urge other countries to follow suit. Rich, developed countries must step up with major contributions to the new fund, and polluting industries must also be made to pay. If the COP presidency can build on this with a consensus agreement on a just phasing out of fossil fuels, COP28 will indeed be a historic event." Pressure will now be on other rich nations to announce contributions as world leaders take to the stage on Friday and Saturday. And First Minister Humza Yousaf has joined global leaders to set out Scotland's ambitions and objectives for COP28 as the climate conference begins. His first engagement was the official opening of the new Heriot Watt Dubai campus with His Majesty King Charles III, showcasing Scotland's influential higher education sector. The First Minister said the campus helped showcase the leading role Scotland is playing in finding solutions for the biggest challenges facing the planet. The First Minister also opened the Scottish Government-supported multi-level action and urbanisation pavilion and met with Global South partners and youth activists to discuss priorities at COP28. Later today, the First Minister will join senior business and trade leaders, Scottish University representatives and representatives of the Global Scots Network at a St Andrew's Day reception, with industry-leading chef Adam Tracy showcasing the best of Scotland's food and drink. First Minister Humza Yousaf said, "I am proud of Scotland's leadership in advocating for climate justice and progressing a just transition to net zero, so it is fitting during the official opening of Heriot Watt University campus in Dubai takes place on the first day of the world's largest global climate conference. This new campus will play a leading role in demonstrating the skills and ideas we have in Scotland to help find the solutions for the biggest challenges facing the planet." Scotland led the way by committing £2 million towards establishing loss and damage at COP26 in Glasgow, and the then First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, announced an additional £5 million, taking Scotland's commitment to addressing loss and damage caused by the climate crisis to £7 million at last year's COP27 climate summit. I mean, Murray, this all looks fine and dandy, but, is it really going to make a difference, do you think? I mean, is the world, as we hit 1.5 degrees as the world's seen the highest raising levels of in sea temperatures, as we watched dolphins boil to death or die from heat stroke and heat pressure in the Amazon River, which is at its lowest that I've ever heard of. I mean, it's running dry in some areas. Are we? Is this enough?
Well, I don't think COP's likely to produce what would be described by many climate activists or those concerned about a climate emergency as enough. I mean, first of all, this is a good development. It's very positive. It's $300 million, which isn't enough to build a large building. And it's been announced by, it falls into the category of government financial commitment announcements. And government financial commitment announcements do tend to involve at least 1.5 countings, if not more. So how much money it actually is another matter. I notice also that although China is now the greatest carbon emitter, both China and India, unsurprisingly, think the US should contribute more than them. And so I expect once again the devil to be in the detail here. The key issue is related to all sorts of things about whether a crisis, and it's not the only contemporary crisis, perhaps the most serious one, whether a contemporary crisis is or is not best represented in terms of historic justice. In terms of historic justice, the US is the greatest carbon emitter. In terms of the contemporary crisis, it's beginning no longer to be. But the question is, I think here, as in other areas, people see things in not necessarily historical terms, but in a historical perspective, and so they look for historical justice. And actually, the crisis is now. So the issue will be bedeviled by the wrangling over those who seek to address it in terms of the contemporary emission issues and those who seek to right or wrong about historic emission issues. And that's one of the problems that we've got. So, but we are progressing. We're just not progressing fast enough. We're progressing towards a level of commitment which will seriously reduce the worst case scenario of global warming by 2100, but it may not do it enough. And I think we've also got to be careful about the optics of this, because when it comes down to ensuring that people move into a zone where they adopt green policies, there is an increasing tendency, and this is one of the reasons for the backtracking on green policies south of the border, for it to look as if people who, and this includes, of course, people who go to COP28, people who fly everywhere all the time, would like to tell people who can't afford their heating bill that they should have a ground source heat pump in a tenement or similar. I think that issue is not going to get much further without serious pushback among Western electorates. And I think we need to consider a situation where we don't actually currently tax jet fuel in the UK, but we're placing a lot of burdens on households in terms, every single household really, in terms of a green cost surcharge for electricity. So in other words, there are a lot of policy choices here. One of the great fault lines is between historic justice and the contemporary need, and also between the individual and how much the individual will pay and the policy framework. And it looks to many individuals as if the policy framework continues to benefit those who fly all the time at the expense of those who can barely afford to heat their homes. And that's something we need to think about more carefully than we are doing.
I mean, there was some statistics came out the other day. I can't remember off the top of my head, but sort of pointing out the amount that the world's 18 top billionaires spend. So their emissions basically can be measured in terms of continents, sort of relating to the. I mean, as I sort of carefully sort through my recycling, and the planes are flying overhead, and you sort
Yeah.
of you see sort of
Yeah.
people going out in pleasure crafts, and you think, hang on, there's something really wrong here. And meanwhile, in Indonesia, they sometimes, through the weather reports, they measure the amount of smoke and smog coming off the burning of the rainforest there, as local politicians basically burn it down to get rich quickly. But I mean, it's often said China is roaring ahead in terms of its sort of green energy and solar panels. That comes at a cost, obviously, in terms of, it could be said that some of the conflicts we're seeing in parts of Africa, parts of Asia, are because of people trying to muscle into the rare earths and everything with these limited materials we have in order to make solar panels and the like. But while China has now overtaken America as sort of an emitter, again, it's easy to look and think, well, actually, that's because China is now making everything which we as individuals are buying, or so America has out. I mean, this is a real problem, isn't it? We're outsourcing the problems to other countries. So even this fund saying that we'll pay other countries that are being irrevocably damaged, that's kind of like, well, it's okay if you guys are going to flood, because we'll just pay you some money and you can find a home somewhere else. But you know, it worries me greatly that we kind of tend to think just throwing money at something or outsourcing something is the answer, when really we're just shifting the problem to somebody else. I mean, where
Um,
where do we go with that as an ethical issue apart from anything else?
well, it's a very difficult. First of all, it's a very difficult issue to cost and emissions. The way one of the reasons, one of the things, if you look at anything to do with ESG in terms of financial or resource management, it's so difficult to actually measure all the consequentials. So it's very difficult to capture the whole cost and the overall carbon emission. There's no absolutely settled way of doing it. So that's that is a major problem, and there are tendencies which both to outsource, as you say, carbon emission, but also tendencies which are anti-globalist now to onboard more home production. So it may be that the balance of carbon emissions will change again in the next 10 or 15 years, and once again, I don't think that is factored into the overall pattern of the way we use carbon. Um, it seems to me that this is an exercise in low hanging fruit currently, and as the low hanging fruit run out, people really don't want to go anywhere else with this in policy terms. And already, individuals are facing costs which they don't see being faced by those who have money to spend and carbon to burn.
Well, in terms of money to spend, I mean, inflation across the Eurozone fell by more than expected in November amid growing concerns about national finances after the sharpest rise in borrowing costs since the creation of the single currency. Consumer prices across the 20-country bloc increased at an annual rate of 2.4%, down from 2.9% in October, according to figures from the EU statistical agency, Eurostat. Economists had forecast a higher reading of 2.7% for November. Falling energy prices and weaker increases in the cost of buying food, alcohol, and tobacco dragged down the headline rate to within striking distance of the European Central Bank's 2.2% inflation target, increasing speculation about the timing of interest rate cuts. In its flash estimate for November, Eurostat figures showed a monthly increase in consumer prices in only two Eurozone countries, Austria and Slovakia, amid easing pressure on living standards across the bloc. Meanwhile, there are concerns about economic growth across the Eurozone weakening further as households and businesses come under pressure from high living costs and elevated interest rates. Economists said cooling inflation and sluggish economic growth across the Eurozone could force the ECB to bring forward a cut in interest rates for the first time since the central bank's most aggressive cycle of increases in borrowing costs since the creation of the euro in 1999. Figures released today showed unemployment across the Eurozone held steady at a record low 6.5%, despite the slowdown in economic growth, with joblessness levels in France, Germany, and Spain unchanged. I mean, this sort of sounds like, oh my goodness, this is terrible. Sorry, my goodness, Eurozone's having problems that Brexit land would love to be having in terms of the economy. I mean, what kind of picture does this paint for you when you're looking at looking at these figures, I'm just going, "Oh my goodness, I dream of having half of these problems." But there we go. Hey, Europe's inflation is falling. Lucky Europe. But I mean, does this show you? Does this show us that what it, the different ways in which the economy is working between Brexit land, the British Isles, and Europe and the Eurozone? I mean, what's your take on this?
Well, Europe, the Eurozone, the EU has got significant, with one or two exceptions, got significant issues with long-term growth. But it has got a more coherent and cohesive set of trading relations than the UK does at present, and it's got a historically lower inflation rate. I don't think people understand just how bad inflation has been in the UK, not just in the last 2 years, but over the much longer period. For example, since 1970, prices in the UK have risen 20 times, 20-fold in RPI terms, and in the US, 6.5 times, 7.5 times, sorry, 7.5 times, as opposed to 20. Those are both significant inflation rates, but one is massively worse than the other. And the European overall inflation level has been in the EU, what is now the EU, has been higher than the US, but again, much lower than the UK. And that's why the pound has ultimately tended to drift lower against almost all developed country currencies over the last half century, because ultimately inflation here is a real problem. And we have made it worse by not being able to easily and quickly import cheaper produce from elsewhere in the EU, particularly perishable produce, and by also not having an open market in services with the rest of the EU. So I fear that what's happening now is that we have championed our own ability to continue to have significantly high levels of embedded inflation because we keep on saying we shouldn't solve labor shortages by having people who are qualified come in to do the job, because that is a way of, we are told, depressing wages and depressing the opportunities for domestic labor. As a matter of fact, there isn't domestic labor to fill many of these vacancies. And of course, where there is some domestic labor to fill vacancies, that means that if there is no alternative except domestic labor, and this is, of course, a Labour Party policy, is to increase the minimum salary that people can be recruited from the EU for, then naturally salaries will go up. And if salaries go up, inflation will go up. And also there will be a shortage of cash elsewhere. The Scottish Government's current shortage of cash, particularly in the NHS, is driven significantly, if not entirely, by public sector pay settlements. Now, people may say that people deserve their salary, those pay settlements of the public sector, but all these things have consequences. And the UK is not in a position as a whole to decide that it's not going to have a free market for labour, services, and trade unless it wants higher level embedded rates of inflation. That's what it's got. And at a lower level, I'm very much afraid that's what it will still have as future years develop.
We could end up in this really wonderful, wide-ranging conversation about the way in which that just seems to demonstrate that the growth economy is something that doesn't work and we need to be heading towards a well-being economy. But that would require, I'm sure, much, much more time than we have. And and a long, long conversation about the way in which perhaps you just need to tear the whole edifice down and start again and look at actually what people really need rather than servicing the needs of the billionaires. tax them all. Moving on, I shall lump these three sad obituaries together. We've got the death of Henry Kissinger, the death of Alistair Darling, and the one that actually I'm most sad about, the death of Shane McGowan of the Pogues. You've got world leaders have offered condolences and praise for Henry Kissinger, a former US Secretary of State who died on Wednesday at the age of 100, as his death elicited sharply divided responses over his legacy. Kissinger shared the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize for his role in negotiating an end to the Vietnam War, but his foreign policy efforts in support of US interests were controversial, and his involvement in foreign conflicts and in overthrowing democratically elected governments around the world saw him branded by opponents as a war criminal. A Rolling Stone magazine headline said, Henry Kissinger, war criminal beloved by America's ruling class, finally dies. Russian President Vladimir Putin said that Kissinger was a wise and talented statesman. China hailed Kissinger as an old friend. While Kissinger was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in negotiating a ceasefire in Vietnam in 1973, many in the region accused him of prolonging the conflict and point to his authorization of secret bombing campaigns in Laos and Cambodia. French President Emmanuel Macron posted, Henry Kissinger was a giant of history. His century of ideas and diplomacy had a lasting influence on his time and on our world. But in Latin America, where Kissinger is widely reviled for support of brutal right-wing dictatorships during the 1960s and 70s, the former US Secretary of State was remembered in far harsher terms. He played a key role in helping to usher in 17 years of military dictatorship in Chile after the US-backed coup against Salvador Allende on the 11th of September 1973 brought General Augusto Pinochet to power and all the horror that came with that. Meanwhile, Alistair Darling has died at the age of 70. A spokesperson for the former Edinburgh MP's family has said, announcing the death of Alistair Darling, a former Chancellor of the Exchequer and long-serving member of the Labour cabinet, was announced. His death was announced today. Much loved husband of Margaret and beloved father of Callum and Anna, Mr. Darling died after a short spell in Western General Hospital under the wonderful care of the cancer team. He was Edinburgh Central MP for 1987 until he stepped down from Parliament in 2015. He served as Chancellor under Gordon Brown from 2007 to 2010. In 2014, the Scottish independence referendum, Alistair Darling chaired the Better Together Unionist campaign. First Minister Hamza Yousaf has sent his condolences. And just before we came on air, the death of Shane McGowan of the Pogues was announced. The duet he performed with Kirsty MacColl, The Fairy Tale of New York, is a familiar and popular song for many at Christmas. I mean, Murray, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we note the passing of figures, and it's people sort of stop to think about such things, and I sometimes wonder about the way in which legacies are observed. It's people like Henry Kissinger, the influence that they had in the world, Alistair Darling, the way he perhaps either saved the banks and saved the UK economy, or put in place deals in which perhaps we still feel the effects of today. And Shane McGowan, who had a long, troubled background with sort of drug use, and yet was an absolute genius in many respects, a punk genius, and had a lot of ill health in later years. I mean, these people all have got mixed legacies. I mean, how important do you, as a historian, think it is that we mark the passing of people who've made an impact on our society?
I think we should, because it's one of the things that gives society coherence and allows us to reflect on the changes that have happened in our lifetime. And of course, of those three figures, with apologies to your love of the Pogues, Henry Kissinger is the world historical figure of those three, without any doubt. Bavarian Jew who was, with his family, prosecuted by Nazi gangs in the 1930s, who got out just in time and ended up in New York and went on to a brilliant diplomatic career in the United States, as well as also quite an academic career too, and is credited with being the architect of détente. And of course, as you mentioned, the Paris Peace Accords, of the Vietnam ceasefire but has remained controversial and also involved. He was traveling internationally only a month or two before he died, when he was 100 years old, and he also had one of the reasons I suspect President Putin is being nice about him is that he had suggested that Ukraine should have a negotiated settlement with the Russian Federation before summer 2022. So he was very engaged in that, for good or ill. He was very engaged in that as well. And of course, he's also in his way an artistic figure, because he appears, for example, in the opera Nixon in China. In every sense, he defines the world of the 20th century from the Third Reich to American foreign policy today. Uh, and of course, I think what you said about Alistair Darling is quite right, but both these things can be right. Alistair Darling used to say that when the Royal Bank of Scotland phoned him up and said they're going to run out of money that afternoon, that was the scariest conversation he ever had in politics. I'm not surprised. So he put things in place which we still live with today, but what was the alternative at the time? And what would any of us have done when one of the largest banks in the world, as it then was, telephones you and says we're going to run out of money by the time it's the sun's over the yard arm? Um, that that is an extraordinary crisis, and I have to say, Alistair Darling dealt with it with immense aplomb and good judgment. In fact, though this would not make him popular, one of his struggles in the last 2 years of the Gordon Brown administration was to get Brown to introduce spending cuts. In other words, the difference between Darling and Osborne was very limited indeed. And possibly the spending cuts that Osborne introduced were worst. They were worse because Gordon Brown didn't want to hear about spending cuts when they were recommended to him by Darling. And once again, I don't in 2014. Better Together, he played a blinder. He stayed well on the weak spots of the Yes campaign. And indeed, his victory on points over Alex Salmond in the first of the two major debates between the two was a signal moment, perhaps even a turning point in the campaign itself. So I've got a lot of time for Alistair Darling. He's an outstanding politician and a very thoughtful guy. And I have to say, though he's a great pop star. Sorry to use him so young. I'll leave Shane McGowan to you.
Yeah, you can't you have to, it's maybe a generational difference, I don't know, but I mean it just, you can't, I
He's old. It was older
yeah,
than me.
Shane.
Come on.
No, for
And he's
me,
hardly
when I
any
came
younger than
across Shane
Alistair
McGowan,
Darling. I'm not a poker guy.
no, he was only a
So
year older, I think, than Alistair Darling, or not much difference between their ages, for me anyway, it was yeah, I grew up. He was 65, but I grew up at a time when I was I was a young thing when punk was coming out, and
yeah,
Shane McGowan was deliciously uncontrollable, and being a good little schoolgirl, I thought it was absolutely fabulous, and decided to try and model part of my life on some of his cheerful anarchic kind of perspective. I think that was the thing, was that he actually was a bit of a humanist. He I saw somewhere that on social media today, someone in a local bookshop in Ireland said that Shane was their favorite sort of famous person, because he would come in, buy lots of books from up and coming Irish authors, and would, leave a significant chunk of my money, like sort of €50 more than was needed for the purchase, and ask it to put it into the poor box kind of thing, or put it to a good cause. So I like people who have money, who actually kind of think of folk who don't. I don't think he ever kind of lost sight of the fact that life is hard for some people. So
that's a
moving on,
lovely.
a
It's a
group of
lovely,
eight.
lovely elegy. Thank you. It's lovely, lovely, lovely obituary, Ruth. Brilliant. Thank you for doing that. That's lovely.
Yeah, you gotta be the Pogues. Anyway, a group of 8 innovative new library projects designed to enrich communities across Scotland will be brought to life through a share of £106,868 support received through Public Library Improvement Fund. Culture Minister Christina McKelvey marked this year's funding award with a visit to Loanhead Library, which has been recognised with the Service Excellent Award for its work, and is one of 4 libraries designated as a warm and well hub in Midlothian. These projects include the introduction of a comprehensive library outreach offer in East Lothian, a digital project, focusing on celebrating Dundee's maritime past and future, and High Life Highlands Sensory Project, which aims to engage with those with autism and dementia, among many others. The Public Library Improvement Fund (PLIF) is an annual £450,000 administered by the Scottish Library and Information Council on behalf of the Scottish Government that sees £200,000 given to support creative, sustainable and innovative public library projects throughout Scotland. This announcement is for the first round of recipients of the PLIF fund, with the second round opening on the 10th of January 2024 and closing on the 7th of February 2024. Culture Minister Christina McKelvey said, "The Scottish Government places great importance on public libraries. We believe that everyone should have access to library services, so I'm pleased to announce this first round of projects for the 2023 to 24 year. 8 new programmes that will make a positive difference to local communities across Scotland." I understand firsthand the valuable service libraries provide across Scotland. During my childhood, my local library was a real sanctuary for enjoyable learning, and it played an important role in my development. Well, when I was a young lass growing up, I was allowed to get on the bus from where I lived and take the bus along to my local library, and I spent hours. I mean, even now, walking into a library, the heady smell of old books kind of makes me feel a bit nostalgic. And there was just this whole world of knowledge in the days before the internet that was just there and at your fingertips. And I mean, this is great news. Obviously, it's fantastic news. But given the pressures that local councils are under, should the should the Scottish Government have paid a bit more attention perhaps to local council budgets to keep all libraries going rather than focusing on 8? Although these projects sound amazing.
Well, you mentioned a sum of money there. It's £107,000 or just under. That once again doesn't get you a hill of beans in public service and public sector. So this is a good news story, obviously, but it's a good news story which is intended surely to take the focus off the impending library closures in local authorities, which may, for example, in Stirling lead to the closure of all but one library. So I have to say, I'm not sure that that's one that's easily soluble by the application of more public funds. There aren't any more public funds to apply in Scotland, is the tough truth here. But and I'm not sure that councils would spend them on libraries if they got them. There are other more pressing things than libraries. So I think we are looking at a situation where library provision continues to decline, and I think basically we have to decide whether the usage of the libraries that remain is such that it won't decline any further or not. Because I would say myself, I know people are very, very nostalgic about libraries, and some people I know are for very good reasons, but times do change, and people don't use a lot of small local libraries, and because they don't use them, they get closed very easily. And then, of course, people who never use them jump up and down and say we mustn't close the library. You know, I remember going to that. I've never actually been to that one, of course, but I remember how valuable they all are. But ultimately, if you want libraries to stay open, we have to use them. And libraries sometimes do convert themselves into welcoming hubs, into having a much wider range of offer than books. But ultimately, a library that is based on borrowing books and DVDs with the odd computer terminal that doesn't work very well is a library that is vulnerable to closure. And I think we've got to face that is the reality we're in. And if you want to repurpose libraries, we have to use them, and they have to be flexible spaces in a different way. Because although I know it's unpopular to say it, it's not the sentimental, the right thing to say. It is actually true that people do not borrow large numbers of books from libraries anymore. We don't live in the world of self-improvement and the trade union movement in 1910. Maybe it'd be nice if we did. It was before the First World War. There were nice things about that, but we don't. And the world we live in is no longer a world for that kind of library.
And people either buy their books online or they can afford to buy them themselves. Those who wish to, I guess. I mean, I guess in the same way,
Or they don't
looking
read
at
books.
the
They don't read books. How many people read
yeah,
books?
that's kind of sad.
Well,
Yeah,
it
but
might be
even I
sad,
don't read
but
as
you're
many as
not
I
going to
used
change
to.
it by giving them making them by having a library open that people don't borrow from. So usage is absolutely key. If any library that's being heavily used is being closed, then there's a very strong reason to defend it. But if it isn't heavily used, it's very difficult to say actually it should be kept open because people aren't using it. And saying it would
Yeah,
be
I mean,
nice if people they
I
did
guess
is not what's happening.
sort of, I guess, wandering bards and town criers came to an end, and perhaps
They
this is
did.
the sort of so. Moving on, the Scottish Government has published its Scottish Languages Bill. Proposals to help Gaelic and Scots languages prosper in the years ahead have been set out in legislation today as Scotland marks St Andrew's Day. The key proposals of the Scots Languages Bill is the creation of new areas of linguistic significance, while would give Gaelic communities a greater say in how the language is supported locally. You see, if we were speaking Scots as standard, then it would be much easier for folk to slip in and out of the lead when we're doing these things in our day-to-day discourse and offices. But I shall revert back to English. The bill has also provides greater support for Gaelic medium education and strengthens and adjusts the functions of Bord na Gaelic to help it continue to contribute to the promotion of Gaelic. The bill also provides the first ever legislative protection for the Scots language, strengthening support for it in public and community life. Schools will be supported to introduce Scots into their curriculums, recognising its place as an invaluable part of Scotland's culture. The Scottish Government will be required to promote and support Scots language education and to report on progress. Visiting James Gillespie's High School as the bill was published, Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, Jenny Gilruth, said, Gaelic and Scots are a fundamental part of Scotland's heritage, but the Scottish Government is determined that the languages will be supported to ensure they are also integral to our future. Learning is at the heart of our plans. By encouraging and supporting learners, we can help more people to engage with the rich history of our languages through song, poetry, and literature, recognising the richness and diversity of Scottish culture. We know the central role Gaelic and Scots play in our culture, and as we mark our National Day, it is important that Scotland unites behind a commitment to ensure our languages have a positive future for years to come. So this is one of these stories which I feel very exercised about because, and you as a historian, you will know more about it than I am sure, but when I was a wee lassie, I went to sort of a suffragette school in the middle of Edinburgh. I shall not divulge its name, but it still sings Jerusalem as its school anthem. And I remember asking us why we were singing a song about England, and basically told sort of had my beast. And then I tried using when I was 8. We had to write a story about an eagle, and I wrote in this story about the lamb's lug, and I was told, well, lug's not a word, use ear. And I said, but it is a word because my mum and dad use it. And they're going, no, it's not a word. And then, so it's basically this whole kind of, and then when I grew older, I had friends up in Orkney and Shetland who were given the belt, they were given the clachan for speaking in Orcadian or Shetlandic in school or in class or in the playground. And sort of just reading Lewis Grassic Gibbon and sort of I think Jeannie, there's a talk about people being taught English, and it was then that I realised that the reason we have English classes is because people were taught English as opposed to Scots, so kind of like so they could be assimilated with the Borg. But I mean, in terms of this rich language that for hundreds of years was the language of court, was the language of law, was the language of business and commerce, what are your thoughts on the way in which we take forward our lead?
Well, Fitty is spearing at me for a while. Anyway, I think that this is a difficult issue. At the time of the Scottish introduction of Scottish studies into schools, which I uh, uh, was involved in the sense that I chaired the National Champions Group. The 8 Scottish language officers were appointed in the end. Only one of those is still in post, and all the rest of the posts have disappeared. So that actually structural support for Scots has been there before and has gone. So this in a way is not a new thing, and it doesn't even quite replace the old thing that's disappeared. But what it does do is to very clearly give a government support to the idea and the use of Scots, which has been growing. I'm pleased to see in recent years, both in the commercial and business sector, and by the intervention of high-profile Scots advocates. Of course, among the older generation, Billy Kay, and I hope you won't mind me saying that. I won't say anything rude about Dundee United, promise, Billy. And among the younger generation by another Dundee United supporter, Alistair Heather, and by Lenny Penny, so young woman who's a recent modern languages graduate at St Andrews. So I think having champions, younger people who are champions for Scots on social media has made a significant difference. And also the long-term and lifetime commitment of people like Billy Kay should not be underestimated either. And indeed, I mentioned Derek McClure here too. So there is an emerging use for Scots. My own view is that one of the problems I've stated this to the some on the cross-party group. The problem is that ultimately Scots grammar is is more or less gone. It's very attenuated. Scots vocabulary still is extensive and possibly even more use than a few years ago. But actually, there are things that it's difficult to get people to do in Scots because the grammar of Scots is really out of use. That's my view. So I think we need to ensure that Scots is supported in terms of things where it's always been strong, such as poetry, things and to an extent drama, things where it's contextually relevant, where there's situational words in Scots that do the job better than anything else, or more distinctive than anything else, or with more diverse content than anything else, and try and prioritize those for the meantime. So I think it's very important that people who use Scots feel supported, they feel wanted, and they feel that their language counts. There are 100,000 words in the Scottish National Dictionary. That's quite a lot of words which are distinctive in Scots from English. Some of them only slightly distinctive, but some of them very distinctive. Many of them very distinctive indeed. And I think we should be as supportive of those as possible. But we must be careful not to imagine that Scots can do anything, because it's been disused for so long, and it always did have different registers. So what I'm suggesting really is that we don't try and run before we can walk here, because if we do start producing loads and loads of documents entirely in Scots, they won't, I'm afraid, always be well written, because they won't be grammatically, they'll be grammatically English with Scots words, and they will invite ridicule. I think we need to defend the strongest areas of Scots, champion them, and to make people, particularly children, feel comfortable about using their own lead.
Aye, because it's a whole thing about removing the cringe, isn't it? You know, I mean, if you were, I mean, I was in the kids' school the other a while back, and there was a sign up saying "say jump, not jamp," but jamp is like the kind of the past participle of jump in the area I live in. So it's kind of like removing allowing your bairns to say lug. But I mean, pride in our national day. I mean, your books include Scotland: The Global History, 603 to the present, and a new history of Scotland. If anybody's interested in good Scots written, books written about Scotland from an academic perspective, but from somebody who actually cares about Scotland and Scotland's past and us understanding our real history, I highly recommend checking out Prof Pittock's works online and getting yourself a book in your stocking for Christmas. But I mean, in terms of St Andrew, how, I mean, there's a lot of myth around an old boy who kind of, has been adopted by a number of different nations. Why are we so big on him?
Well, he's a patron saint. I mean, I think the point that the thing is that St Andrew's Society is extended over the globe in the 19th century, and St Andrew's Day dinners were a big marker of Scottish distinctiveness across the former British Empire. And in the 20th century, foreign suppers stayed, and St Andrew's dinners tended to go. So actually, what we're doing is trying to revive the international tradition of St Andrew's Night, to revive it in Scotland, but also to revive it internationally as a calendar night of celebration. And in giving my evidence to the UK Select Committee Inquiry, Scottish Affairs Committee on promoting Scotland internationally, I did suggest that one of the things that this worldwide should be doing was to have a St Andrew's Night celebration, and that I think appeared in the final Promoting Scotland International report in September. So I do hope we go down that direction. Of course, he's a guy that nobody knows anything about. But people who nobody knows anything about are really good for being heroic or patron saints, because there isn't any dead social media feed or press report to do them down or to tell you what really went on. So I think it's really good we know so little about St Andrew, and it's good that he's our patron saint and the patron saint of other countries throughout several other countries throughout the world, most of whom we are currently friends with or want to be.
I think I saw somewhere somebody said that one of the best reasons St Andrews would be our saint is because 9% of him was somewhere in his, was 9% of his body was somewhere in Scotland. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it was a real, an original clavicle or not, but there's something quite St Andrewsy, I think, in St Andrews meant to be. Well, on that note, I shall, if you're raising a dram to the clavicle of St Andrew, then or thinking about what it means to be Scottish, or thinking what it means to be um, thinking about the future of Scotland, looking at our past and looking to our future, today's a good day to do it. It's also a good day to consider what kind of broadcaster you want to have for Scotland. And here at Broadcasting Scotland, we are always grateful to our supporters for supporting us. Of course, anything that you're able to give us, we have a pressing need to raise a few £1,000 to pay the bills. Quite frankly, the cost of living crisis is hitting hard. So if you've got a wee bobby sticking down the back of the sofa, it'd be really good if you could try sticking it to us and helping keep the lights going. In the meantime, this St Andrew's Day, thank you very much for joining me, Professor Murray Pittock. I'm Ruth Watson. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.